Welcome to this edition of Excavating the Bible, What Archaeology Can Teach Us. This program is dedicated to exploring the contributions of archaeology in the Middle East to our understanding of and appreciation for the Bible. I'm Doug Clark. I direct the Center for Near Eastern Archaeology at La Sierra University, and with my co-host, Dr. Larry Garrity, also from the center and from La Sierra, and Dr. Kent Bramblett, who teaches most of our archaeology classes at La Sierra University.
Not to mention some biblical and other languages.
That's true. In fact, both of you have quite a bit of linguistic background, don't you? That maybe helps us a bit with what we're going to talk about here on the table in front of us. We are moving with this episode away from Kings. I mean, we've been walking all the way through the Old Testament so far to 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And since there's so much repetition, we thought that we would do one episode on 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and we would then think about comparisons and contrasts. Some of this will be review because some of the same events are mentioned. Some of the inscriptions we look at will be review as well. But that's kind of the nature of Chronicles, looking back, reviewing, but with some spins, with some new perspectives.
It's certainly interested in David and how he influenced the history of Israel, isn't it? So it's sort of a Davidic theology.
It is a strong focus on David and Solomon as he follows. But it is, and more, what, the southern kingdom of Judah?
I think I would add what Larry has said. It does focus on the promises to David and the Davidic lineage. So because of that, the northern detour of an illegitimate kingdom in that
hardly mentioned.
It's hardly mentioned except where it interacts with the south, where there's a battle or some sort of situation.
So we want to ask and grapple with a couple of questions. Actually, I think I have a long list of questions that have to do with Chronicles, and we'll turn our attention to that in a moment, but we do have some artifacts in front of us. And so, Kent, I think the languages thing, I think that's when that kicks in right now. You've got a couple of texts.
Well, we're doing some broad overviews here with Chronicles. So the ostraca here, these are letters written on potsherds, are in the alphabetic tradition. And this is how Israel wrote. So when Israel borrowed the Phoenician alphabet, probably initially the Canaanite alphabet, and began to write, we don't have many inscriptions very early, there's a few very rare ones, but they wrote with the alphabet, the alphabetic, the Semitic alphabet that was invented probably in the Sinai Desert earlier, but the Phoenicians reintroduced it following the end of the Bronze Age, the Egyptian Empire, that period. And it became the lingua franca until Aramaic supplanted it, but that's still an alphabetic writing tradition. In contrast to that, we have a cuneiform tablet. And cuneiform is, again, it's a writing system, as you well know. It's not an alphabetic system, so you have symbols, we call them logograms represented, syllabic components, and therefore you have hundreds of signs to learn, rather than just, say, 22 signs with an alphabet. But this was the lingua franca for the great empires of Mesopotamia. So the Babylonians continued to write in Akkadian, Old Babylonian, even though from the time of Nebuchadnezzar, they were actually Aramaic-speaking individuals.
And it's interesting how these letters, the clay tablets, are in envelopes made out of clay. And you have to break the envelope, which has sometimes a similar message on the outside to what you find inside, but it also has to whom it's addressed.
Sealed?
Sometimes, yes, sealed.
You would know if it's been tampered
with
and been broken into.
That's right.
Now, we have lots of cuneiform inscriptions that we've been paying attention to. Not written on tablets, well, some of them on tablets, but most of them, well, many of them on large stone, obelisks?
Monumental inscriptions.
Monumental inscriptions, some of them standing. I mean, how tall is Hammurabi's code? What? It's several feet.
Yeah, a good 6 feet probably.
Yeah.
I think I would say it's taller than you, but it's close. And then so inscribed in the stone. I don't know what it means if you were to make a mistake in the stone, because that's
That's the lapidary form, which is a little more formal even than the clay form of the symbols, which are pressed in with a stylus.
And then baked.
And baked.
I think you could control things a bit better with clay.
Oh,
something
yes.
soft and
Yeah.
and
You had to really be good to write in stone.
But several languages were written using the cuneiform writing system. So Babylonian was written, Sumerian, of course, they're the ones who invented the system. But it was borrowed by other languages.
Ugaritic
Ugaritic
as well.
So therefore, we have to make a distinction between a language and the script.
We do.
So English, for instance, is a language. It does not have its own script, and so we borrowed Latin to write our English script. But if you wanted to, you could use other writing systems to write English.
You know, the alphabet's only been invented once in the world. If you trace it back, it
That's
branches
true.
out. It goes east as variants on the original alphabet, all the way to Southeast Asia via Sanskrit forms. But in the West, of course, it develops into eventually into Arabic as well.
And we have talked about some of the ostraca, the first inscriptions you talked about. We've talked about several of those in earlier episodes. Now, Larry, you have in front of you several lamps. The Book of Chronicles, while it has this extensive genealogy, chapter after chapter, it really begins with what? With David, I suspect. So what do we have here in this sequence of lamps?
Well, since we're talking about David, he would have been very comfortable with a lamp like that. When he talked in the Psalms about the word being a lamp unto his feet, that's what he had in his mind for a lamp. And as time goes on, it becomes sort of this shape, and you see how the spout is not pinched like it is here. It gradually gets more and more pinched until you come down to the Persian and the Hellenistic period, and it tightens right up. And then after this, people said, well, instead of starting with the bowl form and pinching it like this, let's make it out of a mold with two holes, one for the wick and one for putting in the oil. So you can see the development through the very time that Chronicles is writing about in those lamps.
And I suspect something like this one more for basically the extent of the monarchy.
Right.
Long period of usage. Then we have a few religious artifacts, a couple of types of figurines, animal as well as human. The human ones often are, well, the facial characteristics are interesting. Typically, a fairly pronounced nose. Now these are at the early end of the time period we're talking about. But these pinched, I've heard them called beaked. Is that a title that some people use?
I've heard that, yes.
And they stick out there. I think that they look a bit unusual, but when you read even biblical books like the Song of Songs, the Song of Solomon, you have a nose that projects
like the Tower of Damascus.
Yeah, that doesn't strike us as particularly beautiful, but evidently it did to people then. And the animals probably used in worship settings too. Some have argued toys, I suspect. But so we have worship, daily life, and then kind of the textual tradition.
Scribal traditions.
Right, scribal traditions. So what we want to do is look at a few slides that will kind of trigger some conversations about Chronicles. We'll not repeat everything that we did in Kings. That would take us too long. Kent, I want you to come over here. Well, first of all, an outline of First Chronicles and Second Chronicles. And so we're just going through the whole thing, but notice how important the reign of King David is, and then Solomon, and then moving to the end. But we have several maps. So talk to us about maps. You love maps.
Right. We're beginning with David. I mean, we had the genealogies, Chronicles going way back. But Chronicles begins the storyline with David. So when David comes upon the scene, it's a tribal mosaic. The landscape is all the way from Dan in the north to Beersheba in the south, and somewhere in Transjordan as it approaches the desert here. And it bumps up against the emerging peoples of Ammon and Moab especially.
As they're developing.
As they're developing at the same time. So what's happening then during the time of David is that these tribes are actually finding it's better to work together, and they're sort of grasping towards centralized leadership. I mean, we had false starts under maybe Gideon, you know, there was some talk about that, but certainly then, and of course his son he refused the kingship, but his son Abimelech tries to be king.
Wanted to be king.
Right.
Would you say that David, who was at home in Judah, and his first capital was there in Hebron, which is on the map, when he really wanted to unite all the tribes, he decided to move to a more central area, and one that didn't belong initially to one of the tribes. So it was an attempt to bring unity and
so wouldn't
cohesion.
privilege his own tribe. I think that was very deliberate. David does even more similar things. He moves up into Benjamin to a neutral city after he neutralizes it, when you would say first, when he takes Jerusalem. But exactly right, and he has a couple of high priests, he does other things that help bring this coalition of tribes together under his leadership. And the intent then in Chronicles is to follow this Davidic leadership down through the centuries.
Right.
And so then we move to the kingdoms.
We do, and it doesn't work quite so well. No. Following Solomon, it splits somewhere along this line indicated here. Benjamin seems to stay because Jerusalem is in Benjamin, so that tribe stays with Judah, making the two tribes. We've sort of lost Simeon, which in the previous tribe map was down there, but we count the upper tribes, the 10 northern tribes, which also includes the Gad and Reuben over here.
And then some surrounding states too.
As Israel and Judah are emerging, the Ammonite peoples emerge under a kingdom, as do the Moabites, and further to the south, the Edomites. And if we could extend the map up here, we would have more than a dozen Syrian, Aramaic-speaking states emerging at the same time under King style of leadership.
So now we're going to back up a few thousand feet and look at two empires.
Right. Those, especially the Syrian kingdoms up here, didn't last too long because the great powers once again began pushing westward. Assyria had been a power hundreds of years earlier that had pushed all the way to the Mediterranean, and they retained that cultural memory and wanted to do so again. So it's not very long following the time of David and Solomon that the Assyrians began knocking out those smaller states. And similarly, Egypt recovers to some extent, never a really great empire again, but under David and Solomon, they didn't have to worry about these great powers. In the subsequent years, they did. They always had troubles. Even with Syria, the kingdom of Damascus, the Aramaic Syrian kingdom here. And so this then is what develops as the Assyrian Empire at its extent. Nineveh, well, we have Ashur, the religious capital of Assyria. It gives its name Assyria. We lose the SH in the translation to Greek. It becomes Assyria. Kala, Nineveh, and other sites were variously the capitals. And for a short while, the Assyrians actually dominated Egypt at the extent.
Okay, so what happens with the empire that brings everything crashing down?
Right. The Assyrians had pretty well conquered down all the kingdoms except Judah. The Babylonians then sort of have an internal revival and manage to push the Assyrians sequentially westward. They take out Ashur, I think in 614, and move up to Nineveh, 612, and then push westward as the Assyrians withdraw, first to Haran, and then finally Carchemish falls in 609. And then it leaves the Babylonians with really no major opposition, just small states to take over. And they decide to take out Judah as well, that last really independent state before Egypt.
The Assyrian kingdom that we saw before, that map, they took out the northern kingdom. Well, they took out Syria and the northern kingdom, 732, then 722. But now the Babylonians are coming in and they finish Judah. Is it because of rebellions? Is it because of, does it tie to money? Is it, should we follow the money in answering that?
Probably so. There's initially some willingness to probably work with the situation. Of course, we remember in Hezekiah the story of the treasure that the Babylonians see. And there's always the pull as well as the push aspects to these
A lot
tribes.
of that treasure has been carted off, first by Assyria and then the Babylonians, and certainly the Judeans are left without very much, not many resources.
Right. And Judah had seemed at this time to always try to depend on Egypt, which really doesn't have much to offer at that point.
Right.
And the Babylonians come back 2 or 3 times and finally just finish off the state.
Thank you, Kent, for taking us through the maps. Now some questions. Okay, should we grade this as a quiz? Maybe not. These are questions which I hope can help us get at the differences between Chronicles and Kings. And in the process, we think about some archaeological things. We don't want to take too long because we have some more inscriptions that we want to come back to. So, from when do these 2 books, or in the Hebrew Bible is 1 book, come?
Well, since it covers the same material as Kings, we know the part that was important to the chronicler to include. You mentioned the genealogies that he uses to start with. And so we know about when he was probably working because those genealogies end. And so we figure that it's toward the end of his, of the writing of the books.
And you do have the Cyrus references at the end of Chronicles. So that means
almost
this
down to
has
the
to
Persian
be pushing down post-exilic. And I think that's what gets at an answer to some of the questions about the differences, because now we have a community that is in need of encouragement, not one that needs the prophetic blast. You're here because of, or if you do this, this is where you're going. Everybody knows what happened. Now is there a way out? And I think people have pointed out the positive, hopeful, helpful nature, even when the same stories are told between these 2 books. Well, I need to look at a couple more. So, why do we have them? Is it because of the different audiences along the way that we repeat the stories?
I think the chronicler said, you know, we've got Kings, but the whole story isn't there, and it's not told the way I want to tell a story for the very reasons that you suggest.
So there's a kind of a preferred
history,
a preferred telling that brings out certain lessons. I actually think that we could learn a lot about the Bible by paying attention to this. And we'll look at another illustration in a minute where there were live audiences who had special needs, and biblical writers under inspiration tried to meet those needs. And they changed over time. And so we have a much more optimistic, we have more prayers in Chronicles. We have another Passover, this time with Josiah. We have these positive reads. We don't read the negative stuff about David. We want to spin this so that it's a bit more positive. But again, for a spiritual lesson.
And New Testament does that too. We've got 4 Gospels, don't we? So it's not just one story.
Right. So, and maybe this first long question here, and I won't read the whole thing, gets at that same thing, that the more positive. So the community at the end of the Babylonian captivity were grappling to know what to do to avoid anything like it in the future. And there actually were lots of answers, biblical answers. Ezra and Nehemiah is a fairly restrictive, exclusive, don't spend any time with any of these foreigners that could tempt us back into idolatry. Other materials, parts of the book of Isaiah and other books, tend to be more open, and the way back is to be more open and inclusive. And that's all in the biblical materials. So we have this diversity responding to human need, responding to their need. So, preferred past, we've used that word before. The sweep of Chronicles. We will not go over the whole thing. We've kind of talked about it. Important people, David and Solomon. Good kings and bad kings. What marks them out? Either in Kings or Chronicles. What marks them out as good kings or bad?
Well, in Book of Kings, again, it's how they relate to the covenants of Deuteronomy. But it especially becomes an issue, the cult sites that were set up in the northern kingdom of Israel. So really none of the northern kings get to be good, because even the better of them still, even say Jay here, still retain those border sanctuaries at Bethel and Dan, which are in opposition to the temple, even though they're worshiping God most certainly at those sites.
So that gives us something of an insight.
Chronicles doesn't really dwell on that, although they draw from the same sources and maybe some additional ones as well.
Well, we want to look at a case study and a couple of texts, okay, which I think have this overarching nature to them. That's what I hope. I have talked about on an earlier episode a book called Situation and Theology, and it's an attempt to compare the different biblical references to a particular war, the Syro-Ephraimitic War, which lasted from about 734 until 732 BC, as you can see. And you can see in the slide where it shows up. And this is probably the chronological order in which it shows up. And each of these, even though Isaiah and Hosea are 8th century, so they're fairly close, 2nd Kings, at least in its final version, we're probably talking about 6th century, and then probably 4th century or so, or 5th, for Chronicles, meeting different needs. And so what this author does is look at the report of this same 2-year war in all of these sources and says, we come up with sometimes differences in details, but primarily it's a different lesson to teach. And so there are a couple of paragraphs I want to look at. We'll take a look here at Tiglath-Pileser, because he's the one, he's the outsider, he's the empire builder who is involved in this war. That's right. And it's called Syro-Ephraimitic because it's Syria and Ephraim, the northern kingdom, against Judah. And Judah says, the kingdom, the empire of Assyria, we don't want to offend them. We don't want to fight against them like these other two do. So we're not going to go that way. And that sets up for these conflicts. And when one gets to places, well, and Sargon, of course, takes credit for the conclusion. We're not going to read the whole text here, but he does talk about at least takes credit for the destruction of the northern kingdom,
which might have
of Israel.
occurred just before he came to the throne.
Right. He stretched.
He stretched it
to take that credit. From the book, a couple of paragraphs. Kent, if you wouldn't mind reading this one for us.
Over a long period, the story was remolded and reapplied, and the concern of those responsible for this remolding and reapplication was not really with the historical attack of Rezin and Pekah upon Ahaz's realm, and certainly not with Rezin and Pekah's fiscal problems. Rather, their concern was with the existing circumstances and with the people of Yahweh in their own days. They were concerned with theology for their contemporary situations.
Which says something about the major purpose of these books, too. They meant to teach a lesson. There was something theological, something important, something encouraging, certainly, with the Chronicles. And that's the book we're talking about now.
They knew how to use history for practical purposes, didn't they?
That's a nice way to put it, Larry. Larry, if you wouldn't mind, finish this.
They believed that by reapplying and remolding the old story of how Rezin and Pekah laid siege to Jerusalem in the days of Ahaz, they had something to contribute to the edification and the building up of Yahweh's people, and something to offer for that same people's warning. From Isaiah to the chronicler, theologians of ancient Israel believed that they could apply the story of the Syro-Ephraimite war so that the people of their own time might the more faithfully continue to live in covenant with Yahweh, their God.
Why not?
Yeah.
Isn't that the purpose of the Bible?
Right.
To bring people to this relationship. And of course, the Bible comes in historical circumstances to audiences that were quite alive and well and who needed particular messages.
The prophets were sometimes called seers, weren't they? Because they were able to apply these lessons.
Right, right. Very much so. Cyrus, Kent, who's this guy?
Well, we come to the end of the Assyrians, to the end of the Babylonians.
And to the end of the book of Chronicles.
To the book of right, to the end of Chronicles, and Cyrus makes his appearance, who is really the founder of the Persian Empire. Not the beginning of its expansion, but the one who is the real force that pushes the boundaries, really to the extents, beyond the extents of the former empires. So Cyrus the Great, when he conquered these lands, as the Persians, they no longer had the same political situation. The Assyrians had deported everybody, destroyed their identities. Cyrus can restore them to their homelands, restore their temples even, and receive the positive effects of that restoration. That is a very positive political
and loyal
subjects then at that time.
Well, we have, not that we have it here. It would be wonderful to have the Cyrus cylinder here. but coming from, what, around 540 BC, something like that. And there are parts of the text that I want you to read. And this will kind of conclude it, but I want the words of this king who is called by Isaiah a Mashiach, an anointed one, a Messiah. So we have a couple of things here. I don't want to read too much, but this is important. So Larry, please.
Exalted Marduk, Enlil of the gods, relented. He changed his mind about all the settlements whose sanctuaries were in ruins, and the population of the land of Sumer and Akkad, who had become like corpses, and took pity on them. He inspected and checked all the countries, seeking for the upright king of his choice. He took under his hand Cyrus, king of the city of Anshan, and called him by his name, proclaiming him aloud for the kingship over all of everything.
Taking under his hand Cyrus, that's almost the same thing as in Isaiah 45. I mean, it's so nice to see these texts resonate with each other. It's almost an echo effect. Kent.
I am Cyrus, king of the universe, the great king, the powerful king, king of Babylon, king of Sumer and Akkad, king of the 4 quarters of the world, son of Cambyses, the great king, king of the city of Anshan, grandson of Cyrus, the great king, king of the city of Anshan, descendant of Thaspes, the great king, king of Anshan, the perpetual seed of the kingship, whose reign Bel and Nabu love, and whose kingship, to their joy, they concern themselves.
A lot of Babylonian theology. And then the final part, Larry, please.
I sent back to their places, whose shrines had earlier become dilapidated, the gods who lived therein, and made permanent sanctuaries for them. I collected together all of their people and returned them to their settlements. At the command of Marduk, the great Lord, I returned them unharmed to their cells, in the sanctuaries that make them happy. May all the gods that I return to their sanctuaries every day before Marduk and Nabu ask for a long life for me and mention my good deeds.
Don't forget my good deeds.
Right.
I mean, there's something in some ways quite touching about this.
Right.
A number of people have pointed to this as a kind of a peace text, a kind of a shalom text. Syria commanded respect and loyalty by what? Brutality?
Brutality.
Right.
Cyrus wants to turn the tables. And this certainly benefits the people, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, who now return. And what is it that Cyrus is doing with sanctuaries and temples and places?
Restoring, cleaning them up, yeah. Would to God that current leadership would take a hint from those earlier days.
If it worked then, and the Persian Empire lasted under this particular model quite a while, at least till we get to Alexander the Great. But in the process, we have a model, I think, for good leadership, important leadership. Thank you, Larry and Kent. And thank all of you for joining us for this episode of Excavating the Bible. We hope the program has given you something to think about and something to enhance your faith, and we look forward to next time. Until then, think ancient, keep believing, and keep exploring. For Excavating the Bible, I'm Doug Clark.